Okay, so a little bit about me. Thank you very much for signing up to this, and thanks, Kevin, for involving me in this. You might want to know why you want to listen to me. Well, I've kind of been in tech for quite a long time now. I've spent something like 20 years in tech. I've been an engineer in all sorts of languages, tech stacks, etc. I've been a junior engineer. I've worked my way up to being tech lead, etc. So I've come across a bunch of disagreements. I've seen how tech has changed in the last 20 years. And whilst sometimes it may not feel that we're all that respectful, we actually are quite a lot better than we used to be. And I would love for us to continue to improve. So, giving you tips and tricks and explaining how you can do some things more is something that I'm really keen to do. When I joined GitHub, I actually was an engineer. So I've been involved in code reviews at somewhere like GitHub, where there is a very high bar on things, and also as a manager now, I've brought on engineers and educated them and got them used to communicating in a respectful style. So hopefully I can convey some of that to you today. So there is a URL here, and unfortunately, while I'm presenting, I can't see the chat. But if somebody could paste that into the chat so it's a clickable link, I'd super appreciate it. In here is the information that you'll need for the 2 breakouts. I've added a further reading section, which is quite tiny at the minute, and I will probably add to that over time. I will also upload the slides to SpeakerDeck, and you'll be able to download them from here when we get there. So this is a URL that you're going to need. Cool. So let's get started. How can disagreements be positive? Isn't a disagreement an argument? Isn't it fundamentally 2 opposing sides with, whatever? Well, actually, that's not entirely true. Everybody agreeing constantly is also not particularly healthy. People have resentments and they simmer and they sit on them and they don't kind of deal with the problems, and then eventually something happens and there's a massive explosion of emotion, and that's even more counterproductive than having a more controlled disagreement. Also in software development, there's a lot of things where disagreement's healthy. Disagreement helps us make forward progress. So I'm going to talk about some of these things just for a moment before we talk on what other reasons for different communication styles. So what are positive outcomes? Learning is a big one. Pull request reviews are a big thing in code. And it isn't just about compliance. It isn't just about, did this person either hit the functional requirements or performance requirements or whatever you're reviewing it for and whatever the setup at your company is. But it's also like you learn ways of solving problems that you might not have thought of. You learn language tips and tricks that you might not know. And it can be that there's a PR where you're like, I don't understand why you're doing this, couched in a very, curious way. And then the person can say, I'm doing this because, and therefore, you're leveling each other up, and also you're sharing domain knowledge. So that's really positive. A huge one for tech is improved solutions. Whilst there are some folks who do think they know it all, very few, if anybody, knows all of the things all of the time. So, even with my years of experience, I will forget things. I will maybe not know some context. So having somebody challenge me respectfully and make me think about something I might not have thought about, or I've forgotten about, or I've been too busy to think about some edge cases, that really helps improve what I or they or together we deliver to the customer. And that's really important. We don't just write programs for the sake of it, unless you're kind of doing that in your own time. We do it to serve a need. We do it to serve our customers. Those customers might be other devs if you're working in dev tooling, for example, but they're still customers, and we want to give them something that works well for their needs, which is important. Now, both of those situations, like the learning and the improved solutions, by going into this and having a positive disagreement, you're actually collaborating, you're working with people. And that can actually build up some great relationships. I remember getting into, over time, the situation where I could have a relatively blunt disagreement with one of my colleagues, which is you need to know the person well before you can do that kind of thing. But building that level of trust and getting to that level of collaboration is really freeing and empowering, because then you can like have well, what about this? No, I don't like that. What about that? And that type of conversation with no fear that you're going to upset your colleague or your friend or your partner if you're using this kind of techniques outside of work. And that just kind of, again, leads to better outcomes generally. And yeah, the respect thing is like being able to have those conversations, finish the discussion, whatever the outcome is, whoever may or may not be proved right or wrong, or whatever you've chosen as the final route forward, and knowing that you still have the ultimate respect for each other, I think is really important too. So all of those things are, really positive aspects. So there's a lot of possibility for disagreement in software engineering. I mean, I'm sure there is in every discipline, but this is what I know best, so this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to cover some kind of common areas of disagreements, just to give you a flavour. What we're going to be doing in the breakouts will cover the first two, really, of these 2 points, because the other two are much more wide-ranging and we need way more than 2 hours and an awful lot more kind of prep on that one. So common disagreements. Design of the solution. This might be in a pull request, depending on the size of it. It might be an ADR, architecture decision record. It might be some kind of issue tracking description, a GitHub issue, a Jira ticket, whatever is appropriate. And you've come up with a solution, or somebody else has come up with a solution, and then somebody else, could disagree with that. Again, there's good and bad reasons for disagreeing, and we will come to that in some of the breakout work. After the design of the solution, the implementation of the solution is like you agreed roughly how you're going to go about doing it, and the direction you're going to take is going to be these kind of high-level objects and do this. But then the actual way you've written some of the functions or methods or whatever, again, language dependent, somebody disagrees with, or you're doing something that will cause, for example, an n+1 query in a database, which means it's not going to be performant and might trip over a live system. That's a very valid reason for somebody to say, hey, we need to rethink this. But also like saying, hey, I don't like this variable name because I don't like that word, and it's not an offensive word, is not a great thing to pick up on for somebody. Common disagreements are also business and technical goals. And this is my manager hat coming on. I'm sorry, folks. But, I've been an engineer. I want to play with the latest hot, shiny thing. I want to build something in a new language or whatever. But if we're not hitting what the business goals are, we're not actually serving the business. And whilst, we can build what we want in our own time, if we have a job, then, we need to serve the business needs. We need to serve our customers. There's also a long-standing disagreement between product and engineering over when and what things are technical debt and when they need to be solved. There's definitely a lot of tension around that in the industry over the years, and many jobs I've been in. So, that's something else we can get disagreements about. And the final one really is team dynamics. I'm not going to cover this particularly other than to mention it, because there's way more on this. And in the further reading in the repo, there's some stuff about dealing with team friction. But, different personalities, different nationalities, all sorts of things. You may, not everybody likes everybody all of the time. What you need to have is to have a working relationship with somebody. But times of stress, I mean, living in a pandemic, is kind of stress. Even if you think your team's functioning normally, that can make people have bad days and weeks, and that can come out in a less than positive way. So those are the sorts of things that we need to think about here. The other thing that I've kind of learned more as I've progressed in my career and done a lot more people things than pure technical things is that, wow, people are hard. They really are. They're incredibly complex, and there's a lot of reasons for that. I am not a psychology student or a sociology student. There's presumably absolute ton of reading in that area. Everything I'm going to talk to you about is kind of tech related here. And there are things in further reading if you want to follow up on some of this, and we can talk about it, or you can ping me afterwards. But the three main areas I want to cover are ask versus guess, personality and customs, and then company culture, because they kind of all play a part. So ask versus guess, this was not something that I really understood properly until a few years ago, or at least not to give it this term. But there's a situation or cultural norms, and those cultures are not related to nationalities necessarily, where it's okay to say, could you do this for me? And the other person will say, no, I'm sorry, I can't. And both people will walk away from that. And that's a perfectly okay interaction. But for folks who try and avoid that kind of rebuffal, then they're going to try and drop hints, many of which, if you're not used to that kind of communication, you're not going to pick up on. So an ask is, as I gave in the example, I can ask for anything I like, but I'm also okay with being told no. A guess is you try and get to the point where you think it's going to be a yes, or you're like 90% certain it's going to be a yes. And the ideal situation for you is you don't even make the request. You drop enough hints that somebody then says, hey, would you like me to do X for you? And you go, oh, yes, please. Okay. People are generally one or the other of those kinds of person, and they find the other alien and hard to work with. There's no right or wrong, but knowing what you are and working out what other people are allows you to communicate better with them. I have some colleagues that are very guess oriented, so I will go out of my way, especially if I can't read the signals, to say, I'm not really sure what you're asking of me here. Could you be more explicit? But it's okay to say no, and give them that safety blanket and that kind of thing. Guessing requires a lot of shared expectations and experiences, dropping hints, and that's actually a skill in its own right. But they then ask folks to be rude or blunt or aggressive when you're not. You don't think you're being aggressive if you're an ask personality. Ask folks, and I include myself in this, tend to find guessing people frustrating when they're like hinting at what they want, and you're like, I know they want something, can't quite work it out. But again, it just is what it is, and it's just learning to work with that. I would say, very, very simplistically speaking, Western cultures are more ask and Asian ones are more guess, based on articles and studies I've read around this. However, I'd say I actually work with a lot of American colleagues that can be very guess oriented too. So don't relate it to nationality at all. Definitely just keep this kind of thing in mind though. Next one, personality and customs. So there's the type of environment that somebody's been brought up in. There's cultural and caregiver norms. There's, I can say this, I'm like British. We are taught to queue from an early age. We don't like queue jumpers from any other nationality. This is important to us, and queue jumpers will get a very harsh look and a lot of tutting. So, it seems very silly to other nationalities, all of that, like the fact that we care about queuing and our response to it, but that's just what our parents did, what our grandparents did. And people pick up on these things. I definitely very different to my parents now. I've traveled in various countries, I've learned other things, but it takes a while to expand your horizons, to think differently. There are also natural tendencies to ask versus guess. As individuals, what our parents did or didn't do. And they're not necessarily kind of related. I'd say my mom is more on the guess side of things. And it's, again, we can have much better conversations now as I'm an adult rather than a teenager, and I've got more experience and communication like that. But there is kind of what we potentially call A-type personalities, people go-getters, people wanting to move forward, and then there's other people who spend most of their time trying not to offend anybody. Again, no right or wrong, but they just exist and you need to be aware of them. I think there's also explicit versus implicit in communication. For me, This also comes usually from a point of forgetting that you need to share context. I don't generally think it's malice driven. So, for example, something I was talking about with my team just before Christmas, and one of my colleagues based in Spain was like, "I don't understand that phrase. Or can you give me some background on that?" So there's using idioms when you're not with native English speakers, if you're English, or idioms in your language if you're with non-native speakers of your language. There's but there's also assuming somebody knows something when they don't. Other than that, like, can you get this thing to me by the deadline? And they'd be like, what deadline? And you haven't been explicit enough about that, for example. Just again, small things, but it's amazing how so many tiny things can build up into how we communicate and disagree. Okay, and then finally, in this section, company culture. Again, this is veering slightly off how you would do communication necessarily, like tips and tricks, which we will get on into in the breakouts, and there's a cheat sheet at the end for you. But trust in the team and trust in the company leadership matter. And psychological safety is talked about a lot in engineering leadership. And it's vital actually to get to high performing teams, which is what every business wants, because they want the best out of their teams. But it really can affect how anybody behaves, about whether they speak up about something or whether they just pretend they haven't seen it. And that can come over in not having a disagreement that ought to be a disagreement for code reasons or site safety reasons. There's also, what are the cultural norms on interacting? GitHub has a really amazing culture where we're very open about saying, how do I do this thing in public Slack channels? Not every company has or have had that kind of environment. Asking for advice, being willing to learn and collaborate is an important part of our culture. Not every company has that. The way people communicate on pull requests in some companies can be quite antagonistic, I've seen and experienced. You're going to have to work out what you're comfortable with in terms of what you can tolerate, what your boundaries are. But then, if you're okay in a company with those boundaries, then, working out how best to communicate in the style that's kind of generally used at that company is probably useful to you. You also kind of, again, learn from that for future jobs, future opportunities. There's also, finally, how much of a top-down tell setup a company has. Is it do the things I say or else? Is it work towards this goal any way you see fit? How empowering is it? How much autonomy do you have? Because if folks are really feeling pressure and they don't have autonomy, then they might react in a not so positive way. I'm not excusing that behavior. I'm just giving you kind of information that you need to bear in mind depending on the experience you're going through and the environment you find yourself in. Okay, so let's go on to how we handle some of these things. And I want you to, this is the sort of stuff that is probably remembering when we go into the breakouts. So curiosity, that's a big one. Ask questions. Don't assume you know it all. Don't assume they've given you all the facts you need. If you have a confusion or you don't understand why something has been done in some way, don't just say, I think this is wrong. Ask them why they've done it in that way so that you can get some of that information, get some of that context. And seek to understand why somebody's done something the way they have. Very, very few people, again, act out of malice, but either in what they're giving to you to review or hopefully you in reviewing it. But asking open questions are good ways of doing that. The other really important one is empathy, to put yourself in the recipient's shoes. I know I've had feedback on pull requests and documents and things where I've felt, oof, that stings, or what on earth have they written that for? Think how you'd feel if you got the feedback that you're about to give somebody. Again, this does tie into cultural norms and everything else, because if you're comfortable with kind of blunt conversations, that's kind of okay, but try and think about the person you're interacting with too. There's cultural sensitivities. People may or may not have had good experiences in these kinds of conversations at previous jobs or in universities and schools and so forth. Again, you can't control any of this, but it's just something to be aware of, and something that people can learn and grow and change if they're willing to do that. I think overall, you've got to be ready to learn and ready to share your knowledge and opinion. You're not always going to be right, and the other people are not always going to be right. You might not understand why something's been done, they explain it, you're like, oh wow, okay, I learned a thing. Or that they explain and you're like, yeah, but I don't think that this solves X, Y, and Z. So you're sharing your knowledge and opinion. So there's lots of ways you can take things forward. However, you've got to know your limits. There's times to speak up, and there's times to let things go. In code reviews, I'd say a lot of things that you probably ought to let go are things actually there should be limiters for. You know, if you're going to be arguing with people about semicolons and spaces and tabs and things, have an agreed standard, have a linter. They're not things to waste energy and capital arguing with somebody on and potentially ruin a kind of working relationship. You also got to be realistic. There are times we need to build technical solutions that are not academically ideal because we have deadlines and business goals to meet. Also, the business needs to be a business. It needs to survive. There will be things that you may not agree with in that area. Again, you need to know your own boundaries on that one. And also going into conversations, when you go into that disagreement or potential disagreement, what's the outcome that you'd like to get? If you're going into that to be argumentative, I've met people like this, then maybe don't. But also, you know, like if you're saying I'm trying to get this PR to the best state it is, that can be in the back of your mind in your communication with the other person. You can even say to them, like, I don't really get this, but I really want us to deliver a real good solution. And then they can see where you're going, you know where you're going, and maybe they will be able to tell you, and get a good conversation going. So this is kind of a really useful thing before we go into the first exercise that is good to remember, that really you're trying to build relationships. There's humans involved here. It isn't, we're in tech, but it isn't all machines and code. Positive disagreements can move everybody forward and help the business. And also those relationships grow over time and they make further communication easier. So there's less thinking involved, and you know you can say certain things to certain people, and you get to learn each other's styles and so forth. So keep that in mind, along with the kind of empathy and aspects of it as we go into the exercise. So